Turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 11 and find verses 3 and 4. This is our second lesson on the kings of the south and north. Daniel chapter 11 verse 3 says, "Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these." As we get into this prophecy, you are going to be amazed at the precise details that are given in this prophecy. And this is about 300 years before these events took place. The significant details of this prophecy are found here in chapter 11. Chapter 11 has 45 verses, making up 12 paragraphs in the New King James Version. It is easier to review the material going from paragraph to paragraph rather than verse to verse. So we will be following it that way, looking at a group of verses and then finding out what they have to tell us. The prophecy covers the same history as does the prophecy of the ram and the male goat, but going into much more detail on the conflict between the Ptolemy and Seleucid dynasties. We finished our previous lecture with verse 2 of chapter 11. We saw there would be 4 kings following Cyrus, the king of Persia, and the fourth of which would have more power, wealth, and political influence than all 10 kings of Persia that came after Cyrus. This fourth king was Xerxes, known to us in the Bible as Ahasuerus. He accumulated more wealth than all the other kings of Persia, and it was he who put Persia into conflict with Greece. 6 kings would follow him until Persia was defeated by Alexander the Great in 331 BC during the reign of Darius III. The scriptures we just read, verses 3 and 4, give us a brief recap of Alexander the Great. History plainly tells how he did according to his will, becoming the most notable military genius in perhaps all human history. Alexander died at the high point of his kingdom, which was the Greek Empire. What is notable about this prophecy is that it shows that the kingdom would be divided into 4 parts and that none of his posterity would share in its rule. All the members of his family met tragic ends. His wife, Statira, was murdered soon after his death by his other wife, Roxana. Let that be a lesson to those that believe in multiple wives. It does never really work out. His brother, Aridius, who succeeded him, was king for about 6 years. He was killed along with his wife Eurydice at the order of Olympias, who was Alexander's mother. Olympias was then killed by soldiers in revenge for the killing of Aridius. Alexander Aegis, the son of Alexander the Great, was killed along with his mother Roxana at the command of Cassander, who was king of Macedonia. 2 years later, his other son, Heracles, was killed with his mother Barsine by a man by the name of Polysperchon, who was regent from 319 to 316 BC. And when you see the title regent, that's a person who reigns in the name of a juvenile king or queen. So the one that was murdered was not a grown man, he was a boy, and he was murdered by the regent. So, the facts of history tell us that within 15 years of the death of Alexander the Great, none of his family members remained alive. So says history, and so God prophesied through Daniel some 300 years before it actually happened. Moving on to verses 5 through 8, which is another paragraph. It says, "Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion, and at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand. But she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. But from the branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt, with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold. And he shall continue more years than the king of the north." The kings of the south are the Ptolemy dynasty that ruled in Egypt. The first king that became strong is Ptolemy Lagus, who was a general under Alexander. He became strong and had great dominion. The realm under Ptolemy's rule included Egypt, Phoenicia, Arabia, Libya, Ethiopia, and some other areas and minor kingdoms. The king of the north, appearing in verse 6, are the Seleucid dynasty that ruled in Syria and as far east as Persia. The first king of this prophecy is Seleucus Nicanor, who was a general of infantry under Alexander the Great, and he was the most powerful of all of Alexander's successors. It is said that he had 72 kingdoms under his rule. Ptolemy and Seleucus were hostile toward each other, each desiring some, if not all, of the domain of the other. And both were strongly against the Jews. Ptolemy invaded Judea and took Jerusalem soon after he gained control in Egypt. And the story is that he came to Jerusalem on a Sabbath, pretending to have a friendly visit. So be careful of your friends. They may come to take over your city and your country. Verse 6 records an attempt to unite the two kingdoms by means of a marriage. The verse says this would happen at the end of some years, which it did about 70 years after the death of Alexander the Great. After sustaining losses of some of his kingdoms along the Mediterranean seaboard to the Seleucids, Ptolemy Philadelphus had his daughter Berenice, some of these names are not easy to say, his daughter Berenice married to Antiochus II, Theos, in 250 BC. Philadelphus died about 4 years later, and the fact that Antiochus already had a wife did not help matters any. Verse 6 makes an understatement about what happened next. It says, "She shall not retain the power of her authority." The plan to unite the two kingdoms failed, as Antiochus divorced Berenice and took back his former wife, Laodice. Soon afterwards, Laodice poisoned Antiochus and murdered both Berenice and her infant son. Immediately after this, she proclaimed her own son, Seleucus II, called Callinicus, as king. And Callinicus was the son of the original Seleucus here. So, war breaks out between the two kingdoms again, as is reported in verses 7 and 8. The person identified here as a branch of her roots in verse 7 is Berenice's brother Ptolemy Euergetes, who declared war against Callinicus and invaded Syria to avenge his sister's death. He wins the war, and he extends the limits of his kingdom as far north as Antioch in Syria. The name of that town sounds familiar because that's where Paul went after he was converted, left Jerusalem. He went up to Antioch and spent some time there before he went out on his missionary journeys. But that marks the furthest north that the Ptolemies extended their kingdom, their rule. Verse 8 says that he shall continue more years than the king of the north. Callinicus reigned from 246 BC to 225 BC, which is a total of 21 years. Euergetes ruled from 246 BC to 222 BC, 24 years. So the scripture is correct. Euergetes did reign 3 more years longer than did Callinicus. And this was prophesied over 300 years before it happened. This is how smart God is. God sees all time from eternity. It's not like he is living in time. He can see not just what is happening. At the same time, he sees what has happened and what will happen. And when we read these prophecies, it should just cause us to rejoice, not necessarily in the events that happen, but that God is God over everything. He's God over this whole universe. He sees everything that will ever happen in time. From the very beginning, when he said, "Let there be light," till the very end of what we call time. God sees it all right now. The next paragraph is verses 9 and 10. This says, "Also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. However, his son shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Then he shall return to his fortress and stir up strife." You know, these people could never settle to have their own country. They just kept invading each other. And the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were the worst of the 4 divisions of the Greek Empire on this. The king of the north, Callinicus, led Syria in an invasion of Egypt, but he had to return to Syria to put down an attempted insurrection led by his younger brother, Antiochus Hierax. Callinicus was eventually defeated by his brother at the Battle of Insira in 235 BC. Continuing family trouble and insurrection plagued Callinicus until he was killed by a fall from his horse in about 234 BC. He was succeeded by his elder son, Seleucus III, surnamed Serranus, and later by his younger son, Antiochus III the Great. Seleucus, the older son, ruling from 225 BC to 223 BC, was weak and unable to rule his army. Eventually, he was poisoned by members of his army. Have you noticed as we're going through these historic details, how many of these people are murdered by poison? It just seemed to be the preferred way of getting rid of royalty in those days. Antiochus III the Great ruled from 222 BC to 187 BC, and he was the 6th ruler of the Seleucid Empire. He was only 18 when he came to the throne. And this is the one identified in verse 10 who would certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. Under him, the Seleucids recovered all of Syria that had been under the control of Euergetes. remember the king of the Ptolemies, that Antiochus did pass through is seen in that he penetrated the occupied territory and pressed his army all the way to Dura, which is near Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast. And it was there he made a 4-month truce with Ptolemy IV Philopator. Okay, that was the king after Eurygetes. He pressed his way through. He was over here east of the Jordan River. Okay, and he pressed his way all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. He pressed his way through. From there, he returned to his fortress located at Raphia on the border of Egypt, which is located in Gaza near the modern city of Raphia. And that city in that area has been in our modern news quite a bit. The next paragraph is verses 11 through 13. It says, "And the king of the south shall be moved with rage, and go out and fight with him, with the king of the north, who shall muster a great multitude. But the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. When he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail." Ptolemy Philopator defeated Antiochus at Raphia on June 22nd, 217 BC. After the victory at Raphia, Philopator made peace with Antiochus and returned to Jerusalem, where he pursued an easy life of luxurious living that eventually led to his losing his power. History records that while he was there living in Jerusalem and all this luxury, that he went into the temple specifically for the purpose of defiling the temple. It just seemed that the Ptolemies and the Seleucids had this thing about trying to defile the temple of God, and this man was no different. The war was renewed after 14 years after the defeat of Antiochus at Raphia. During this time, Antiochus engaged in successful campaigns against Persia and India, and then returned to make war with Ptolemy V Epiphanes, who was the son of Philopator. Antiochus is said to muster a great multitude. Matthew Henry supplies us with information on this multitude. He writes, "The king of the north, Antiochus the Greek, shall return with a greater army than former. And at the end of times, that is, years, he shall come with a mighty army and great riches against the king of the south, that is, Ptolemaeus Epiphanes, who succeeded Ptolemaeus Philopator his father when he was a child, which gave advantage to Antiochus the Great. In this expedition he had some powerful allies. Many shall stand up against the king of the south. Philip of Macedon was confederate with Antiochus against the king of Egypt, and Scopas his general, whom he sent into Syria. Antiochus routed him, destroyed a great part of his army, whereupon the Jews willingly yielded to Antiochus, joining with him, helped him to besiege Ptolemaeus' garrison. We'll stop here because the history goes on and we see other characters brought into the picture. But we see the great detail that God gives Daniel in this prophecy. When we looked at the ram and the male goat, there was a lot of detail about the Ptolemies and the Seleucids in that prophecy. But in this one, we're getting down to just really some of the deep details. The marriage to try to cement the two kingdoms, and the stabbing in the back and the poisoning and all these kinds of things. So come back next week and we will continue this study.